He's now doing a major project on green hydrogen here in Canada, which I was telling him earlier is a subject of great discussion here in Europe anyway. So Richard, please walk us through the storyline and let's see where we go. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jachin, and thanks for the invitation. It's always nice to be here and connect with you. And let me say, I joined this group, I think, during the pandemic. So I think virtual has been great because as Jachin is out of the country right now and people are calling in from all over the place. But I look forward, maybe we can have some in-person events. It'd be nice to connect with some of you in person, but it's nice to do it virtually as well. So, the title I gave you was Building a Green Hydrogen Future, Fact or Fiction. Look, and let me walk you through a few thoughts. I'm principal advisor international affairs for a company called World Energy GH2. I'm doing that as a consulting arrangement. They're developers of something called Project New Jehonek, which I'll explain in a moment, is aiming to be Canada's first commercial scale green hydrogen, green ammonia plant. I wanted to walk you through a bit of the context on hydrogen, just very briefly, more to kind of provoke some conversation, a little bit about the project and some of the challenges. I do have a few slides since that seems to be the standard here in these presentations, so I didn't want to veer too much from the standard. So let me put those up. Excellent. Okay. So what are we talking about? So why are people talking about hydrogen? Well, obviously the world's on this. We're all trying to strive towards a net zero world. There's lots of different pathways. It's quite interesting to look at, across countries, the kinds of paths to net zero that people are charting. And here I put up a report I thought was quite good from Canada's Institute for Climate Choices. In Feb 2021, they put out a report called Canada's Net Zero Future. And they outlined both to 2030, and I put their graphic from 2050, kind of what they saw as a set of safe bets or wild cards to get us to 2050. And I want to be very clear on this, consistent with that report and other thinkers in my work at IISD. If you're looking at safe bets and you're trying to solve most of the climate problem or the net zero problem, energy efficiency and electrification are your biggest opportunities. I'd say that right off the bat because I've said it in other when I've been in other roles, including with IISD, and I'm sure Jachin and others can explain to you better why that is, but electrification, I think with the drop in cost in renewables, with the kind of double dividend of using clean electricity and things like electric vehicles, the fact that not only can you use you have clean electricity as an input, but the fact that you can minimize a lot of losses when you go with directly electrification, you get efficiency gains. Just because you're not burning an energy source inside of a car, or you get the magnificent, seems at times magical, the energy efficiencies from a heat pump. Electrification, I think most countries agree, is kind of the primary pillar for the path to net zero. And it's why so many countries, including Canada, I believe, will need to double their renewable electricity supply. But within all of those plans, hydrogen often has a role to play. Here it's quite small. I mean, in this report's maybe a bit more skeptical. It's got it as a wild card. And I'll talk to you in a moment on where hydrogen might be used, but there is a case for it. And there's some debate. And Jachin and I were just talking about this before you all joined, which is, there's a lot of boosterism around green hydrogen. And so the question is, what's fact and what's fiction? One of the reasons there's a boosterism is, when you ask the question what hydrogen can be used for, well, it's an energy carrier, so it can be used for almost anything. People have described it as being kind of the Swiss Army knife of energy solutions. You can look across this little Swiss Army knife, and well, people have talked about blending it with natural gas. You can use it for cooking and heating in industrial processes. Maybe for heavy transport, passenger vehicles. Right? We've had Ballard and fuel cells, aviation fuel, shipping, whether through conversion to methanol or ammonia. And I think this is actually a useful analogy about the Swiss Army knife, because you could use a Swiss Army knife to cut down a tree, but that would be pretty stupid, right? So just because you could use hydrogen for something doesn't mean that you should. Could does not equal should. So where should you use hydrogen? I think one of the really good thinkers, and he's quite a skeptic on hydrogen, a guy named Michael Liebrich, who founded the firm that became Bloomberg, New Energy Finance, BNF. He sold it off to Bloomberg. Still writes and thinks on hydrogen, and he's been quite critical, actually, even about green hydrogen in Canada. But I think he's quite a good thinker, and he's sort of crowdsourced this over the last couple of years, his so-called hydrogen ladder. And I think this is a really good way to think about the problem. Because basically what it says is, look, there are some ideas, some boosterism around hydrogen, in the F and G categories that look pretty far off. Like I'd say, for example, for light transport cars, in his category G. Look, never say never, but it's hard to believe that hydrogen fuel cell cars will ever overtake electric vehicles, given the efficiency gains. Given that if you go to hydrogen, if you convert it from renewable electricity, you're going to have losses. Why not just use that electricity directly in an EV? Now, that's not to say that it doesn't have some applications in transport, and you see things like long distance trucks and coaches moving further up, heavy transportation moving further up the ladder. What is also clear, I mean, that's what interesting about this fact or fiction about the use of the Swiss Army knife is there are areas where you really want to use the Swiss Army knife. So, for example, fertilizer. Fertilizer right now, actually, the production of global fertilizer is 1% of global emissions, if you can believe it. Most people wouldn't realize that, and that's because the hydrogen used to create the ammonia comes from is from natural gas. And so it's pretty clear that if we do want to get to a net zero world, we're going to have to get to a form of green hydrogen where we want hydrogen to be used in industrial processes, whether it's fertilizer, hydrogenation, hydrocracking, desulfurization. There's then a question of, what are other, as you go from those unavoidable, the kind of there's no real alternative except green hydrogen. Then I think there's a lot of debate now about where the possibilities are, and we're in the middle of a lot of those debates. Steel, for example, I think is one of the most exciting. Of course, you can do iron ore refining right now. It's done with coal and primarily, or electric arc furnaces for the production of steel. But hydrogen allows you a way to do it very green, to achieve those high temperatures that you need with very low emissions. And so you see projects, for example, in Sweden that promise to have a real impact. There's other use cases that are looking quite attractive, including in shipping. I won't go into all of those, but I think Liebrecht's hydrogen ladder really starts to kind of and maybe I'm giving you a hint where I'm going with my title, fact or fiction, right? Is that there is some use cases here that are fiction, but there's clearly some use cases that are really strong in fact. So there is a market. And that's why, for example, countries like Germany have set ambitious hydrogen strategies. Overall, the EU is now looking to produce 10 million tons and import another 10 million tons itself of green hydrogen by 2030. The reason they're looking for imports, or the logic for it, is if you think of the production of green hydrogen as coming from renewable electricity, in areas where you don't have a lot of renewable electricity, you should save those green electrons, those precious green electrons, for things like heat pumps and EVs, right? But if there's jurisdictions like Atlantic Canada or Spain or North Africa where you might have an abundance of renewables, is there an opportunity then to create some of that hydrogen and ship it? And that's the belief of a number of market players and countries around the world. So the EU wants this target of 10 million tons of imports. They want it to be green. They've got some of the highest green standards in terms of making sure that that hydrogen is produced from renewable electricity. And that's why in August 2022, Chancellor Scholz, Prime Minister Trudeau visited the site of our project in Stephenville, Newfoundland to sign, their ministers signed the Canada-Germany Hydrogen Alliance, which actually aimed for exports in 2025, which, maybe sounded aggressive in 2022. It sure sounds aggressive now in 2024 because it's only a year away, but it's good to be ambitious. And they talked about potential co-financing, some of which has been put in place through the form of investment tax credits, others through demand side supports through a mechanism called H2 Global. Things like contracts for difference are still under discussion. But that's this active partnership, the Canada-Germany Hydrogen Alliance, between the two countries to foster this corridor, to talk about co-financing and get the green hydrogen trade happening between Canada and Germany. So it was in response to that well, not in response to that. This actually started a little bit before it. That Project New Jehonik came under development. New Jehonik is a Mi'kmaq name for Bay St. George, or which mean, in the Mi'kmaq language, it means where the sand blows. So that project, we're aiming to be Canada's, as I said, first commercial green hydrogen ammonia producer. It's a large scale project. Phase one is 1 gigawatt of renewable electricity, which is something like 160 turbines, billions of dollars of investment, a very significant infrastructure project. You might say, well, why there? Why the West Coast of Newfoundland? And it has to do with a handful of factors that I think are driving green hydrogen projects right now around the world. The first is wind. Where do you have either wind or solar in good capacity for a wind or solar farm to produce those green electrons? And in this case, it turns out this project originally, before I joined it, they had been thinking it would be offshore wind because there's quite a phenomenal offshore wind there. But it turned out that onshore wind, doing the measurement campaigns that we've been undertaking, there's a world-class potential, we think, for onshore wind in the west coast of Newfoundland. And so that's reason number one. The other reasons are, we've got access to clean water. We're on a site that was a former pulp and paper mill that using that water supply allows us to form the hydrogen from electrolysis. We've got a port that was built by the U.S. Army, a deep water port that we've just acquired. It's one of only a couple of privately owned ports in the country. We acquired it earlier this summer to be able to ship ammonia or other e-fuels. We've got access to a clean grid. Newfoundland's grid is over 90% clean, 96%, I think it is. And that's important because, again, the EU green standards, if you can use grid power as backup, it makes your project much more economic. But it has to be renewable electrons to meet the European standards. And then finally, but equally important, is we've got community support, both with the Indigenous First Nations groups that we're working with in the local communities, because you can't do a project like this without that kind of support. So just a couple more slides then to feed into the conversation. So what does it take to make a project like this successful? I mean, here we could talk and write multiple PhD theses on it. And I'm sure many of you have thoughts on this. I was reminded, thinking about it, I put up here a paper I wrote, actually, it's over 10 years ago, when I was at IFC in the World Bank Group. We looked at 40 plus kind of 60 plus infrastructure projects in over 40 developing countries. And we kind of tried to look at success factors. And it won't surprise you that when you have major infrastructure projects that are a form of public-private partnership, there's a range of things you've got to get right around the technology, around the economics, around the social, political factors, and then being able to execute it. I've always been a fan of this book by John Deutsch. Maybe some of you know it, Making Technology Work. In his conclusion, he says, look, real problems are an inseparable mix of technological, economic, environmental, and political factors, and you kind of have to address them all. I think it's easy, for someone like me who grew up as an engineer and a physicist. I think it took me many decades into my career to realize that, look, just because a project or a technology works or is scientifically possible, then you think, well, okay, and if it's economic, well, then everyone should do it. But look, there's a lot of other factors that come into play, including, as we've learned with nuclear, are they technologies that people are comfortable with and can they live with? So for our project, there's a lot of different issues to think about here. In terms of the technology, electrolysis is not new. There is a lot of development in terms of electrolyzer technology that's coming along. And so projects like ours face a question of what's the balance of existing versus new technology. Of course, if you want a bankable project that people will finance, you need to think about existing tech. But if you want to, get down that cost curve, you got to think in multiple phases and how to use future technology. The economics are absolutely key here. We've got to think about the cost of green hydrogen relative to blue. That is hydrogen formed from natural gas and carbon sequestration. The kinds of tax credits that are put in place, the kinds of demand side supports that are put in place are really key. And that of course ties to political factors in the overall policy landscape. Because what are those measures that governments are going to put into place? How effective or expensive are they going to be? Things like carbon border adjustment mechanism that may make our project much more competitive. And then, of course, environmental factors, which is the whole reason for doing this. And our environmental impact statement is over 3,000 pages, a lot of environmental factors to work through to make the project a success. The just to wrap up, I think what I'd say, so that's a very broad kind of survey of the kinds of issues. If you look at green hydrogen in general, and what they're facing right now in terms of, meeting these ambitious targets that governments are setting, I thought this firm, Wood Mackenzie, laid it well at the end of the year in their 10 predictions for energy in 2024. Because they talked about two of the key challenges that projects are facing is working on cost, given the rise in interest rates, given the competitiveness with blue hydrogen with fossil fuels, getting the cost of project down and really doing the engineering and making these projects real is a key factor. The other is commitments from off-takers. I'll say that as you talk to customers for these products in Europe, they see what government is saying, but there's a little bit of a it sometimes reminds me, some of us have talked about it as being like a junior high school dance where, the guys are on one side and the girls are on the other, or whatever gender, right, is on both sides, and they're kind of waiting to see who's going to dance. And it's a bit like that with the industry, that you've got producers like us, you've got potential off-takers, and you've got governments, and everyone's kind of waiting to see what the rules are and the final economics are before they're willing to sign big binding agreements. Because nobody wants to sign an agreement at too high a price, right, and look stupid. At the same time, projects like ours can't really get financed unless they've got binding offtake agreements. So that's really a key signal to look for, is those commitment from offtakers. So look, that's a very quick survey, and maybe just to kick off the discussion, I will say, I said the title of my talk was Fact or Fiction. Well, where I'm going with this is that it is fact and fiction, right? So clearly, there's some use cases for green hydrogen that don't make a lot of sense. How will these ambitious targets be made, be achieved? Who knows, right? But we obviously feel confident at the core here. There's a very powerful use case. It's hard to get to net zero without green hydrogen in certain sectors. And so we feel that there's a strong market there, and our investors agree with it. And so we continue. And, I think if we do it right, we think that Canada can continue to, have that energy leadership that they've had for decades, and help the world to move to net zero.